Okay, so today I want to talk about this book that came out in 1981, I believe, in the French version, 1983 in the English version. It's titled Ethiopia, an Heretical Revolution, question mark, by René Lefort. And actually, I recently just read this book for a class presentation of which I'm basing this video off. And I thought it was an interesting book. I really enjoyed, I'll just give a general overview of what I thought before I sort of get into the intricacies of Lefort's arguments, what he contributes to the sort of historiography surrounding the Ethiopian Revolution, and some critiques that I definitely have. Not terrible ones, but, he's not a historian, so he's a journalist, so reads a lot like, a news report or sort of a journalistic analysis where he's sort of telling what happened. He was there when a lot of these events during the Ethiopian Revolution were taking place. So he has a lot of first-hand accounts that I think are valuable to, historians. But he also doesn't, I don't think, follow sort of really strict academic historical sort of research or like has a specific theoretical framework that he's working off of, these different things, which this isn't to say, denigrate his work, but it is sort of palpable when you're reading through it. You notice it, especially if you're used to reading historical text specifically. With that preface, I kind of just want to get into it. So René Lefort's book was, again, published in French in 1981. Its English version was published by Z Press in 1983. And this book is basically about the 1974 Marxist-Leninist revolution in Ethiopia, what social groups played a role in bringing about a Marxist-Leninist revolution, and what made the revolution in Ethiopia so different from other revolutions like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or even other African anti-colonial revolutions. And that's primarily why, Lefort titles the book as such, right? Ethiopia, an Heretical Revolution. It's sort of a question that he's asking throughout his text. He suggests that the revolution in Ethiopia was sort of heretical, right? It was outside of the way that we usually conceptualize revolutions, because the revolution was brought about by a sector of the Ethiopian army, right? Particularly a Marxist sector of the army that almost saw itself as the vanguard. So Lefort articulates that the idea, right, behind this revolution was that, quote, the army alone could foster this embryonic proletariat so that it would grow without being destroyed, reach adulthood, and thus become the conscious and organized working class, the driving force of the revolution according to all Marxist doctrine, unquote. So he argues that this was how the Marxists in the army conceptualized their role, right? They were sort of the vanguard. He says they wished to accelerate the class struggle so that consciousness and structures would make up for the accumulated backwardness of centuries, but to keep a close enough eye on it, even at the risk of distorting it, so that the side that was supposed to win did not lose. So this is Lefort sort of laying the ground as to why the revolution became so authoritarian and dictatorial, because the army, particularly the Derg, through General Mengistu Haile Mariam, would sort of see themselves as the vanguard, which was not how proletarian revolutions would usually, describe themselves, or what proletarian revolutions look like, which is not usually what, Marxist-Leninist working class-based revolutions would articulate. So there was a sort of disconnect between the articulation of this revolution and then on the ground conditions of like what was actually happening, because again, it was the army, not a sector of the working class, that sort of seized power in this process. Lefort was a journalist, like I mentioned, that began to work in Ethiopia in the 70s. There isn't too much about his biography online, but he is mostly known for this particular book, and he, continued to actively write articles and stories about Ethiopia as a freelancer for different news organizations like Le Monde, The Africa Report, Ethiopia Insight, and more. So he has a lot of experience in the country. He has, lived through some of the more important historical moments, so he has, a lot to offer. But in talking through some of his motivations or justifications for writing about this revolution, he notes that the revolution in Ethiopia didn't really capture the popular imagination of Westerners, and that whether it even was a revolution was up for debate. In essence, he says that the Ethiopian revolution remains ignored because deep down it is disturbing. Now I had to pause, why is it so disturbing to the Western psyche? And so, part of the reason why it was disturbing, as he articulates, or even heretical, is because he says the revolution that broke out was incomprehensible to us. Now, the statement clearly articulates what position, his positionality. He's not lying about the fact that he's a Westerner living in in a non-Western country and then reporting on it. And, he's narrating this history for the consumption of a Western audience, because he's using, the pronoun us. He says it was incomprehensible because we, there goes that pronoun again, the West had practically nothing to do with it. So he took it upon himself to sort of unravel the mystique that is the Ethiopian revolution. He says it's a revolution that owed almost nothing to anybody except Ethiopians, and some conflicts among the nations and peoples making up Ethiopia. So this is the main thing that made me feel like, okay, I don't think a historian would make such a boxed in argument. Like, I don't think a historian would approach something like a revolution and be like, yeah, this social upheaval during the Cold War, no less, was something that was immediately the result of the internal contradictions of a given society. I feel like even by the 1700s, the world was too complicated to make such an argument. So when I read this, I'm like, I don't think a historian would, whatever iteration of a historian that you are, would make this kind of argument, because I feel like it misses the root of the context, which is the Cold War politics, where everybody and their mama was getting involved in each other's business, right? So when I read this, I was like, okay, this is not, I don't think, a historical argument or a valid historical argument. But then maybe I'm just being chauvinistic about like what constitutes a historical argument, but this is my take, right? And so in addition to, being totally of its own making, he also says that the revolution was incomprehensible, right? And he gives different reasons as to why it was incomprehensible, which also feeds into its hereticism, if that's the word. So he says it's incomprehensible because the bloodletting that began early in the revolution, and this is particularly the execution of about 60 people from Haile Selassie's regime that he's referring to, that bloodletting started before the sort of Solomonic myth that had legitimized the government had really begun to fade in the popular consciousness. So before people really believed or can conceive of the end of the Solomonic dynasty, people in that regime were getting killed. So it was, in a way, that the Derg sort of preempted the masses in this way. He also said that it wasn't too long before the revolution began to attack different sectors of the population that were its oldest sort of harbingers. And he's particularly talking about like trade union leaders, university and high school students, and even parts of the military like the Air Force. So the revolution sort of started to cannibalize itself. And he also says that the revolution was already chained to the millstone that was the Eritrean question, which Lefort argues was denounced and vilified, and finally attacked with military means on an unprecedented scale by the revolution of which it was the child. So the Ethiopian Revolution, despite articulating ideas of self-determination and working class, solidarity, all these, Marxist talking points, was in reality denying that same self-determination to, people in Eritrea. As we know, whether it be the Haile Selassie's government or the Derg regime, Eritrean self-determination was not something that they were willing to even consider. Right, Mengistu Haile Mariam specifically was, had said that the only solution to the Eritrean question is a military solution. So he was in no way gonna debate on that topic. So that was another sort of facet to this revolution that made it so different, right? It wasn't as if the Eritrean question became a problem later. This was a question that the revolution inherited. And then a final reason was that Ethiopia had sort of closed itself off to the world, even more than the imperial regime, argues Lefort. So part of the reason it was heretical or incomprehensible was because it didn't fit nicely into the conceptions of anti-colonial revolutions that were taking place in Africa. You couldn't really compare it or draw a sort of composite picture of revolutions in Africa to which Ethiopia would fit in. It was sort of a Russian doll of conflict within a conflict within a conflict. And so again, he's trying to unravel this, and he's trying to unravel it as someone who's also seen some of the events that have made up this really long process of a revolution, right? Because it didn't just happen in 1974 and then a new regime was installed. It was one characterized and colored by warfare and bloodletting and invasions and all these different things. And so his main argument in this text is that the revolution cannot be understood in terms of its own Marxist-Leninist slogans or even in the light of previous revolutions in the Third World. He says for centuries Ethiopia has been a world apart, and its revolution was in no way due to an overly delayed decolonization or an invasion by imperialist military forces. So the revolution in Ethiopia was a product of its own making, right? It was riddled with internal conflicts. It was exacerbated by the larger conflicts in the Cold War. But to Lefort, it's ultimately of its own making. And it was a revolution that was given life to by varying sectors of the population, but one that the revolution ended up attacking those same sectors that gave it life. And like I mentioned earlier, I already took issues with this claim because I feel like if he had looked at the student movement, and I know on this channel I've like talked about the student movement, if he had looked at that movement, they were arguably one of the early forces that really were the face of resistance as early as the late 50s even, and definitely the 60s. He would see that they sort of likened their struggle against Haile Selassie to an anti-imperialist one, right? It was anti-feudalism, anti-imperialism, right? Tsara feudalism, Tsara imperialism, right? And they used decolonial language in politics. And I'm directly pulling this from Dr. Amsala Alamu's dissertation, Revolution Beyond Redemption, which she talks about, where one of her main arguments is that, the student movement had to use, it was actually necessary for them to use decolonial politics in their articulation of their struggle against Haile Selassie. And I can link to that in the description. I think it's a great read. But yeah, they used decolonial language and politics because they saw the autocracy of Haile Selassie on par with colonial domination, right? And emphasized the sort of influence of British and then later American interests in Haile Selassie's government that they couldn't sort of see outside the conception of imperialism, especially when Marxism and Leninism was being introduced to the student movement. Now, how accurate they were is another question, because one of the main critiques that we see about the student movement is that they really didn't, and this is a broad strokes, right? But the main critiques is like they didn't really apply Marxist analysis in the way that was appropriate. They just sort of adopted it wholesale to the Ethiopian situation without Ethiopianizing it, I guess is one way to think about it. It was more of a tool to justify what they already believed in, right? It was a ready-made sort of analysis that they could not usurp, but like I said, just adopt and then make everything in Ethiopia sort of match that framework as opposed to the opposite process. Because Lefort sort of refuses to look at the revolution and its genesis outside of its own Marxist-Leninist slogans, as he says, he comes to the conclusion that the West had nothing to do with this, right? Again, during the Cold War. The West had everything to do with everything during the Cold War. Anyway, and so the contradiction within Ethiopian society were totally of its own making, of the makings of the society itself. And I think this is one of the sort of results of sort of essentializing not essentializing, but it's one of the results of taking to extreme measures the sort of independence of Ethiopia, sort of taking that at face value and saying, okay, this was, colonialism in the way that we've understood it in other parts of Africa and the rest of the world didn't pan out the same way that it did in Ethiopia. And so we could sort of make this analysis that, okay, whatever's taking place in Ethiopia is outside of that framework of colonial domination, which is something that I plan on sort of really challenging because I myself go through academia. But yeah, I think that argument stems from that sort of understanding, and so it's important to note that at this point in the 20th century, as in the early and mid-century, right, Ethiopia was an agrarian society. One could argue it still is, but this meant that, the economy was highly dependent on the coffee and the sort of grains that it exported to the West. And in addition to that, we all know it was headed by the absolute state vested in Haile Selassie. There were famines that were happening on a periodic basis. Masses who lived outside of the capital and who really were the engines of the Ethiopian economy bore heavy taxes while also working the land and then paying the rent for the land that they labored on. And then the surplus of value that they generated was one that was consumed by the landowners in the city, or the balabats, the quote-unquote wealthy peasant, or the sort of intermediaries between the working farmer and the landowner. Yeah, that situation was far from ideal. Life in the countryside back then, and then even today, is not an easy life by any means. Life for the workers in the capital was a bit better, definitely, but the really vast sort of inequality was something that Haile Selassie really took great pains to hide, right? So this vast economic inequality is something that the students later come into contact with, which I believe ends up radicalizing them. In the early chapters, Lefort traces, which groups were beginning to show their dissent and how exactly they were going about it. And one of them was an individual, Aklilu Habtewalda, who was prime minister from 1961 just until the beginning of the revolution in 1974. And he wanted a sort of parliamentary monarchy and a bunch of reforms, but still with some of the monarchy still intact, right? He tried to sort of organize support among the army, because that was another group that was also seeking change in the government, but they weren't a fan of him, argues Lefort, because he didn't really have the sort of right social background and status to be leading a new Ethiopia in their minds, because, he would have been the sort of the political head of this new parliamentary monarchy that he was trying to fight for. But what's interesting is that this clique of people who were seeking to oust Haile Selassie, right, were elites themselves. It wasn't the kind of reform motivated by the sort of best interest of the masses in hand. It wasn't a working class based, overthrow of an ancien regime or ancient regime. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it wasn't that. I think it was more of a power grab, because you see other members of the nobility also trying to work with the military to put in power who they wanted. So it was very, high up in the social ladder, the sort of dissent that was brewing. But even again, the dissent wasn't one that wanted to do away with the monarchy completely, or with the system that existed. And then another visible and of course powerful voice of dissent were of course the students. And there's the book by Bahuru Zawde, where he goes very deeply into the history of the movement called the Quest for Socialist Ethiopia, which I've also talked about on this channel. And they really played a big role in organizing, introducing Marxist thought to the Ethiopian intellectual tradition, and ultimately sort of being the harbingers of the revolution as well. But what's different about the students, though, however much they were critiqued, is that they were resisting against the very nature of autocratic monarchy itself. They thought Haile Selassie was an imperialist stooge working for American capital. They deconstructed and critiqued the very myths that legitimized Haile Selassie's rule, and even used decolonial politics in their political tracts and their studies. And they sort of saw themselves fighting colonialism and imperialism and feudalism as it was manifest through Haile Selassie and the empire, and sort of found inspiration among other African liberation struggles as well. But also because of the students, crucially enough, members of the army were also beginning to be radicalized. They began to see themselves as those best prepared to, quote, seize power from the autocrat in order to give it to the people. And here, Lefort argues that there was another dimension to this, one that the army saw as the oppressive Amhara ethnic group. He writes, the goal was then to overthrow the regime so as to be able to decolonize, not only to destroy the autocratic and feudal order, but to destroy the very essence of power in Ethiopia, its Amhara identity. But even before the revolution proper began, those within the army were divided among those Lefort refers to as the Marxists and the Radicals, which I thought could have been a better term division, but because in my mind, Marxists also denotes being radical, but let's go with it. So the Radicals wanted to quickly disband with the regime and set up a new democratic regime as soon as possible, right? And this democratic regime presumably may also be liberal bourgeois, not too sure. But the Marxists wanted to sort of wait, presumably until the time was sort of ripe for such a thing, as Marxists are wont to do. But also because of the failed coup that took place a few years prior in 1960 was still fresh in their minds, right? The failed military coup by the Nawai brothers. And they also feared that reactionary forces would be quick to want to restore the dynasty in this moment of a power vacuum. So they saw more of a long journey process that would necessitate a, quote, slow maturation and a profound cultural revolution. And so what's different about this process, Lefort argues, was that the real struggle in this revolution and the violence that we end up seeing was not so much between the emperor and his opponents as one would expect it to be, but rather between the opponents themselves. He says one part of the army against another, non-commissioned officers and other ranks against senior officers, Marxists against radicals supported by the intelligentsia, the students, the unions, in fact by the modern elites and the urban petty bourgeoisie. And so once the delegate was in power, they were thinking about ways to sort of export the revolution to the countryside. And one of the ways they did this was through land reform. Now, land reform was probably the most important campaign that the students raised, and they were organizing. A lot of historians sort of have consensus on this. The land question was quite important. And this was, a question that was really pertinent to the everyday conditions of the farmer because of how exploitative the system was. In March 1975, the Dark implemented land reform by nationalizing all rural land, abolishing feudal land ownership, and distributing plots to peasants. Another one was the Zamecha campaign, and this was basically a campaign that was supposed to politically educate the masses of Ethiopians on, the basics of Marxist thought and sort of have them buy into this new social order that the Dark was trying to implement. And the Derg put the students, I think even as young as high school students, to the task of politically educating the peasantry. Some were willing to go, but some were definitely forced. Again, it was not an easy life in the countryside in Ethiopia, so not everyone was up and ready to go. But about a year later, when the land reform was decreed, some of the students took it upon themselves to try to enforce it in these different areas that they had been deployed to. But overall, this sort of campaign was a failure because it's speculated, that the Derg did this to low-key remove the students from the capital so that they couldn't do too much damage in terms of organizing against the Derg. They were one of the forces that could rally popular support in the event that the Derg became unfavorable. And the students, and the Derg had different ideas of what it meant to actually put the land in the hands of the farmer. You see different clashes between members of the Derg and the students in these different parts of Ethiopia. And Lefort includes a couple anecdotes that show the tension that existed between the students and the military at this time. And it would come to the point where the students eventually felt betrayed by the Derg because their ideas of a socialistic Ethiopia was not really one that the Derg was, at this moment in time at least, or some might argue ever, was actually trying to put in place. That's not what I'm trying to argue, but this was an important piece of it, right? Where we see this rift sort of create. Not that they had a perfect relationship when the revolution began, but this definitely didn't help any prospects of their relationship as well. And another way that the Derg was trying to sort of export the revolution was the peasant associations that the Derg set up. And this was in order to enable peasants to participate in the political, social, and economic movement through peasant associations with a view to help the broad masses administer their own affairs. So on paper, it was about encouraging, semi-autonomous self-government and self-determination on the part of the peasantry. But Lefort argues that the institutionalization of the peasant associations were more to serve the state, to allow it to reach into the daily life of the countryside, than to make it possible for the peasant communities even to gradually take over the levers of administration. So the theme that we're kind of seeing is that the Derg espoused a lot of, good socialistic ideas, at least on paper. It just didn't translate well into application, especially when disagreements over these concepts ended in terrible bloodshed and, calling opposing forces enemies of the revolution and so on. And, being called an enemy of the revolution basically is like, you're fair game. So, as I mentioned earlier, another really important matter was the Eritrean question, as well as the national question, and I'm going to sort of talk about these together. As we went over earlier, Lefort has argued that the Ethiopian revolution at its onset was chained to the millstone that was the Eritrean question, right? And so just to go over some of the very basics of, the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia up until this time, when the Italians came to take part in the scramble for Africa, they decided to invade Eritrea and began settling in about 1880. And by taking advantage of, the disarray that sort of existed in the empire at the time, by 1889, they had fully established the colony and began to refer to it as, Italian Eritrea, and it was sort of formalized through the Treaty of Wuchale. And this is the same treaty, by the way, that Menelik was tricked by, because in the Italian version, he had signed over the whole of Ethiopia as an Italian protectorate, but in the Amharic version, he didn't do such a thing. So when the Italians attempted to expand south, they were defeated in Adwa in 1896. We know that story. But when he had signed the treaty, he did recognize the occupation of Eritrea, so he ended up sort of shooting himself in the foot there, because this becomes an issue where Eritrea develops its own, national consciousness, goes to war with Ethiopia for many, many years. But why this is pertinent to the revolution and the Derg is because by the 50s, the UN had stepped in and brokered a deal where Eritrea would be autonomous, with its own judicial structure, but the federal government would sort of control the more external-facing aspects like foreign affairs, defense, finance, transportation. But in this federation, Eritrea was not just another region in Ethiopia, it was not a part of Ethiopia in the same way that the Amhara Klil, or now it's called Amhara Klil, but when we're like Benishangul or the Ogaden region were, Eritrea was quite different. It was a federation with Ethiopia, so Eritrea had a lot of autonomy in this federation, and Haile Selassie resented this. Okay, he resented this from the outset, and he would do different things to undercut Eritrean independence until by 1962 he just dissolved the Eritrean parliament and forcibly annexed Eritrea, right? So by the time the Derg came into power, the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia was still raging. It wasn't a situation that had reached any any peace deal or anything like that, what the Derg and the revolution ended up inheriting. And the Derg itself was divided on the question of how to deal with Eritrea, but the winning side, that of General Mengistu Haile Mariam, was one that also denied any semblance of an Eritrean independence, right? So throughout its tenure, the Derg was continuously fighting wars in Eritrea, and Mengistu Haile Mariam was, and actually, the Derg even had Cubans helping them in this in this war against Eritrea. And I'll talk about the way that the socialistic world sort of reacted to the Derg in a few. But that's one thing I remember from reading this book, that there were Cuban forces not only training soldiers to fight these wars, whether it be in Eritrea, whether it be in Somalia, because at this point in time, Ethiopia was fighting all these different wars, but there were a particular Cuban contingent fighting a war in Eritrea on the side of Ethiopia. So throughout its tenure, the Derg was continuously fighting wars in Eritrea, and Mengistu Haile Mariam was just dead set on having Eritrea be part of Ethiopia as just another region, not a federation or anything like that. That was a non-negotiable for him, much like it was for Haile Selassie. So just to go over some of the programs that the Derg initiated in order to sort of put its socialism into practice, we have first the 10-point program that Lefort talks about. And in this 10-point program, it's one of the earlier things. This comes out in December 1974, so about 3 months after, the throne has been snatched from Haile Selassie, or the throne has been dissolved, really. And this is where the notion of an Ethiopian socialism, or Heretical in Amharic, was sort of put forward, a sort of national unity that rises above ethnic differences, as well as the nationalization of the means of production and the concept of the land to the tiller. So it's like these ideas that were pertinent to issues, structural issues in the Ethiopian society, sort of put together as Hibrit. And Lefort argues that this was how the sort of cornerstone of the revolution was laid, and the Derg, right, this small group of soldiers within the military, became the most visible leading power in the wake of the revolution. 2 years later, in 1976, the Derg came together with one of the civilian leftist groups called Me'ison, the Amharic acronym that stands for Mela Ethiopia Socialist Nikanake, or the All Ethiopia Socialist Movement. Yeah, so Me'ison and the Derg came together to write up the National Democratic Revolutionary Program. Now, this NDR was in many ways a sort of continuation of the 10-point program and what the Derg would use to ideologically justify its rule. And like I mentioned, it also cemented an alliance with Me'ison, which for the time being also gave, I think, some legitimacy to the Derg, because it meant something to have the support from, or the official support from, a civilian leftist organization. It's sort of a promise that says, okay, we're not going to be in power as a military forever. We're just waiting until we can give power to the civilian government. So this is what it hinted at. But there was a major disagreement still when it came to the national question, because the NDR that the Derg published only said the right to self-determination of all nationalities will be recognized and fully respected, while Me'ison believed in the right of nationalities to self-determination up to and including the right to separation. And the Derg under Haile Mariam was never going to agree to such a thing, and will, again, fight many wars abroad and inside to keep Ethiopia together in the way that he envisioned it. So now I want to talk about, okay, how did, this is taking place in the Cold War, how did the rest of the socialist world particularly react to this revolution in Ethiopia, right? This is broad strokes. This isn't going to be a total analysis, right? Because this book is dense. When it came to the USSR, initially the USSR wanted to establish a Pax Soviética in the Horn of Africa, and Lefort argues that the USSR sort of nursed the dream of acting as intermediary between the comrades in socialism, meaning Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea, and Yemen, who were enemies in nationalism, and even to reconcile them in a federation. This federation obviously never sees the light of day, obviously, but were it to, really would have been very strategic for the USSR, because it would have had significant influence over the part of the world where, Black Africa and the Arab world meet, right here in the Horn, as well as just really significant access and control of the Red Sea. So during the revolution, the USSR was supporting the Derg, but they were also supporting enemies of the Derg, like Somalia and Eritrea, chief among them. And so the USSR had this sort of wait-and-see policy when it came to who to truly support, because the revolution didn't, again, just sort of happen. It was a long process that started in 1974, but it didn't really conclude until the late 1970s. But when the plans of a federation failed, because think about it, putting together Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Yemen in a federation, no less, very utopian. in my opinion. But yeah, but when the plans for that was patently not going to happen, the USSR ended up choosing to support Ethiopia. And it got a lot of criticism for it because the Ethiopian revolution, as Lefort would argue, was heretical, right? Even at the time, it was seen as one dressed up in the language of Marxism-Leninism, but with the military force and power, with other Marxist groups being brutally repressed and killed, as we would see later, and one that sort of denied self-determination to Eritrea and was only willing to deal with it through a military solution. So there were a lot of things that the Derg was doing that did not fit into a Marxist-Leninist revolution. But as Lefort argues, there were some saving graces of the Derg. The Derg supported the African National Congress, it supported the Polisario in Western Sahara, and it supported the Palestine Liberation Organization. This isn't to say it redeemed itself in a lot of ways, but it also, these different things didn't make it totally condemnable to some people. And it's important to note that at this point in time, the Derg was surrounded by enemies from every country it shared a border with, except Kenya. And there was a whole issue, as we know, with the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, where Somalia laid claim because there are ethnic Somali people in Ethiopia. And, the British involvement decades prior had given, birth to Somali irredentism and the idea of a greater Somalia. So, Mengistu Haile Mariam and General Siad Barre of Somalia were having it out, and there were also tensions with President Numeri of Sudan because they also, fought for influence in the Horn of Africa. They also supported, by proxy, opposing sides and conflicts in Eritrea and Somalia. So a lot of tensions in this part of the world at this moment in time. Surprise, surprise. When it came to Cuba, like I mentioned, Cuba actually was on the ground fighting some of Ethiopia's wars. It supported the Derg and Mengistu Haile Mariam specifically. The Derg had Cuban advisors, trained Ethiopian soldiers, and Fidel Castro was actually quoted to say, "I can say that I know Mengistu well. I consider Mengistu to be a true revolutionary," and there are just plenty of photos of them together. Mengistu visiting Cuba and getting this, great welcome. So they had a close relationship, I think, even on an individual level. So Cuba's support was there. The relationship with China is probably the lightest. Now, Lefort argues China really did not deviate from its most classic positions, beginning with the traditional help yourself, but it did follow the, goings on in the revolution closely, and China, above all, made itself present by sending to Addis Ababa Marxist catechisms by the plane load. So China sent propaganda and Marxist readings and these different things, but wasn't actively there fighting any kind of battles. But Lefort argues that the level of support the Eastern Bloc gave to the Ethiopian Revolution was almost unheard of at this time. He says that the total arms deliveries that came from the socialist countries totaled to about 1.8 billion in US dollars, a billion with a B, in the 70s. So this was significant. And I don't think at this point any other nation had received this kind of monetary aid and arms. And this is not counting, I assume, the human, soldiers that were also sent to fight these wars. If the Derg was fighting external wars with Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, and even with Egypt, internally it was fighting a war with civilian leftist groups within Ethiopia as well. So we already mentioned Meison, and although they backed the Derg in the beginning, they would soon be in conflict with them. And the EPRP is another major player in this revolution, and this stands for the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, was also another Marxist group that was also experiencing repression from the Derg, but they also butted heads with Meison. Now, I won't go into the minute details of every disagreement and clashes these two groups had with the Derg and between themselves, but what's important to know is that there was a division in the Derg itself about whether it's even hand power to the progressive civilian organizations. Mengistu was strictly of the idea that a revolutionary party that will take up the handling of the state was one that'll sort of come from above, presumably the soldiers, or that would, graduate into a vanguard. And this is what Lefort argues was a transcendentalist view of the revolution, a sort of top-down idea of a Marxist-Leninist revolution. Because no matter what, Mengistu was never really going to hand power to these two groups. And so I have here some of the main difference between these two groups. Obviously, they were both Marxist-Leninists, but they interpreted events and the conditions of Ethiopia differently. EPRP was based in Addis Ababa and other more urban centers. Meison had a lot of bases in Europe and was close with Western communist parties. They were both made up of students and intelligentsia. I believe Lefort actually mentions that there was a slight split in which part of Ethiopia members came from, and I believe EPRP was more northern Ethiopian, so more, Amhara, Tigray. Maison had more people from the south. EPRP argued initially when the revolution broke out that the social classes in Ethiopia have crystallized and that, the time is now to take down the Derg, and never really works with the Derg. They never really had a moment of supporting the Derg or working with them. Supporting might be too big of a word. While Maison had argued that social classes have not crystallized yet, and working with the Derg might help crystallize the class differences and then sort of bring about the proletariat revolution that they had imagined. So they, both wanted the same thing. They approached the situation differently, so much to the point of bloodshed, as is common in our history. But the EPRP also saw the February Revolution as a mass revolution, as in a revolution caused by the masses that was then usurped by the Derg, right? So that's why in the beginning they never, decided to work with them, while Maison thought that the February Revolution was a petty bourgeois revolution, which also says that, okay, the classes are not crystallized yet, and right now we're just seeing a petty bourgeois revolution. How do we turn that into the kind of revolution that we want? So some of these differences, were based on the interpretation of Marxist doctrine, but they both ended up being targeted by the Derg, because the Derg eventually makes clear that it's not interested in handing power to any civilian group at this time, and we know as history unfolded that the Derg doesn't really dissolve itself until the 1980s, and even then, it's still Mengistu Haile that's still in power under the auspice of, People's Republic of, PDRE, that one. Now I know I didn't talk too much about Mengistu Haile Mariam, the individual, in this video, but Lefort does dedicate an entire chapter to him at the end. He, talks about, the kind of man that he was, how clever and strategic and charismatic, determined. I mean, it almost reads like an ode to Mengistu Haile Mariam, and I think he does this to sort of show just how impactful he was as an individual. I think there definitely must have been something about him, because again, he managed to get the USSR's backing outside of all the other countries that the USSR could have backed, and he was clearly very close with Castro. So overall, I thought it was a great book with as much documentary and evidence, first-hand account, a lot of in-depth analysis on a domestic and geopolitical level. I think first-hand accounts that you just can't see anywhere else, or anecdotes that you wouldn't come across anywhere else. I think this makes it, this alone makes it an important contribution to the history of Ethiopia. One critique I do have is his positionality, as I mentioned earlier in this video. Now, one of the first things that's made really clear when he's writing is that he is an outsider looking in, and he himself is aware of that. But it also sounds very Gibbonistic, and I know anyone who's studied any form of Ethiopian history or read Ethiopian historians has come across that word, and I just came across it last year. But I couldn't help but feel this when I read this book, and this moniker sort of comes from Edward Gibbons, who was a British historian from the 18th century, that wrote the famous quote that has birthed this idea of Gibbonism, where he says, "Surrounded on all sides by the enemies of their religion, the Ethiopians slept near 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by whom they were forgotten." Damn, right? So Gibbonism is this idea that Ethiopia has always been a world apart from the rest of the world and beyond the comprehension of the West, and Lefort sort of calls back to the same sentiment with his own quote, where he says, "Ethiopia entered our own history on the day a small man with fevered eyes, his shoulders covered with a black cape, mounted the rostrum of the League of Nations to appeal to the international community to come to the help of a country invaded by Mussolini's armies. The listeners looked away." And so this sets the framework within which he's going to examine the revolution, because he starts off from the notion that the revolution in Ethiopia was incomprehensible to us, the West, for these and these reasons. So he's not necessarily concerned about giving voice to those that were voiceless during this revolution, or those that may have been understood, but a bird's eye view of what happened so that a Western audience can sort of make their mind about it. I don't know if that's too mean of a critique, because I do think he still has a lot to offer, but you can't escape that positionality that he writes into his entire introduction. So that's really one main critique that I have. Yeah, I would still recommend it. I still think it's a good read. I think it still offers something to, the historiography of the Ethiopian Revolution. I don't think we should just put it aside because we may have these critiques, but, there is no perfect book. Would I read it again? Probably not. It's not the kind of book you would read more than once, to be completely honest with you. But not because I think it's so bad, but just because it's like 500 pages of, or it's like 400 pages, but it's tiny text. It's a lot. But I did leave me with questions. Does the Ethiopian revolution really defy the general conception of a working class revolution? Was it indeed a heretical revolution, or was this question only asked because of this whole idea of Gibbonism to begin with? And despite the support that he got from the socialist world, was Mengistu Haile Mariam's version of socialism fundamentally flawed, if not outright sort of hostile to the popular, the broad strokes of a Marxist-Leninist type of socialism? So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you have answers and more readings that you think will contribute to this discussion, please drop it in the comments, as they say on this app, on this website. But yeah, let me know what to review next if you guys are into book reviews. Although next I'm sort of thinking about doing a video about these essays that I'm working on, also related to Ethiopia, more like of a historiographical essay where I'm looking at different topics surrounding Ethiopian history and the debates around Ethiopian history. 20th century, obviously, you guys already know. We'll see. Until then, until next time, Nagati.